Welcome back to the channel. Today we have a tale that proves no matter how many ribbons you have on your wall, the most important lessons are usually learned in the dirt. Have you ever met someone who thought they knew absolutely everything about a subject, only to be completely humbled when they stepped out of their comfort zone? Well, buckle up because today's story is about Julian. Julian is a Grand Prix level equestrian. He wears bespoke boots, rides horses that cost more than your house, and wouldn't be caught dead without his perfectly sculpted man-bun. But what happens when a guy used to manicured indoor arenas decides to show off at a rugged working ranch in the American West? If you enjoy stories of hilarious culture clashes, majestic horses, and well-deserved slices of humble pie, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale. Now let's saddle up and head to the Broken Spoke Ranch. The Broken Spoke Ranch sat at the edge of a sweeping valley in Wyoming. It was a place of rust, dust, and raw leather. The men and women who worked here didn't ride for ribbons. They rode to pay the bills, move the cattle, and stay alive in country that didn't care about your feelings. Enter Julian Vance. Julian's arrival was heralded by the crunch of a pristine matte black Mercedes SUV rolling up the gravel driveway, instantly coated in a fine layer of red dirt. The vehicle stopped in front of the main bunkhouse, and out steps our hero. Julian is a professional English rider. Specifically, he's a dressage and show jumping prodigy from the East Coast. He had spent his entire life in climate-controlled riding halls, sitting atop $500,000 Dutch warm bloods, executing precise geometric movements calculated down to the millimeter. He had booked a week at the Broken Spoke for what the brochure called a rustic equine retreat. Julian's therapist had suggested he needed to unplug and reconnect with nature before the upcoming Hampton Classic Horse Show. Julian, of course, assumed this meant he would be given a fiery, unhandled Mustang, which he would magically tame in 3 days using his European riding techniques. Hank, the ranch foreman, was leaning against a post whittling a piece of pine. Hank looked like he had been carved out of beef jerky and old saddles. He wore a Stetson hat that had survived 3 decades of rain and boots that had seen more miles than most cars. "You the retreat fella?" Hank asked, spitting a sunflower seed into the dirt. Julian offered a crisp, perfectly practiced smile. "Julian Vance. I left my dietary requirements with the front office. Mostly macrobiotic, gluten-free, no nightshades. And I was wondering, what time do we access the indoor arena? I'd like to do some light suppling exercises with my mount before we begin." Hank stared at Julian for a long, uncomfortable moment. He looked at Julian's shiny boots, traveled up to the tight breeches, and finally rested his gaze on the pristine man-bun. "Son," Hank rumbled, "our indoor arena is currently occupied by about 400 bales of alfalfa. We ride outside. And out here, the only suppling exercise you're going to do is trying to get out of bed tomorrow morning. Come meet your horse." Julian followed Hank into the barn, expecting to be led to a spirited, fiery beast that required his expert touch. Instead, Hank stopped in front of a stall housing a horse that looked roughly like a furry yellow refrigerator. "This here's Buster," Hank said, patting the horse's thick neck. Buster opened one eye, sighed heavily, and went back to chewing a stray piece of hay. Julian was appalled. This is a pony. He's horribly downhill. Look at his conformation. His neck is practically non-existent, and he's carrying at least 100 pounds of excess fat. I usually ride 17-hand Hanoverians. Will he even understand a half halt? He understands when it's time for breakfast, and he understands how to keep a cow from going where he ain't supposed to, Hank replied dryly. Here's your tack. Hank hauled a massive, beautifully tooled western saddle off a rack and dropped it over the stall door. It landed with a heavy thud. Julian approached the saddle as if it were an alien artifact. In his world, a saddle weighed 10 pounds, made of buttery French calfskin. This thing looked like a leather lazy boy recliner strapped to a piece of lumber. It had strings, giant metal rings, a heavy wooden horn, and stirrups thick enough to double as snowshoes. I'm sorry, am I supposed to lift this? Julian huffed, grabbing the horn and the cantle. He heaved, his core engaging, and barely managed to swing it onto Buster's back. Buster didn't even flinch. He just grunted. When it came time to girth the horse, or cinch him up, as Hank corrected, Julian was utterly lost. There were no simple buckles. It was a long leather strap called a latigo that required a specific, complicated knot. Caleb, a younger ranch hand who had been watching the entire spectacle with a massive grin, finally stepped in. Let me help you out there, fancy pants, Caleb chuckled, tying the Texas T-knot in 3 seconds flat. You don't want that slipping when Buster drops his shoulder. Drops his shoulder? Julian asked, raising an eyebrow. I ride with absolute balance. My seat is entirely independent. I assure you, I will not be unseated by a pony. 10 minutes later, the group was ready to head out. Hank, Caleb, and 3 other cowboys were mounted effortlessly on their quarter horses, the reins held loosely in one hand. Julian, however, was treating Buster like a Grand Prix Dressage horse. He gathered the thick, heavy leather split reins into both hands. He shortened them up tight, trying to establish contact with the horse's mouth. He pressed his calves tightly against Buster's sides, trying to push the horse into a collected frame. Buster, who had spent 15 years being ridden on a loose rein with a curb bit, had absolutely no idea what this strange man was doing. The tight reins were pinching his mouth, and the constant squeezing on his sides was highly annoying. So Buster did what any respectable ranch horse would do. He stopped walking, pinned his ears flat against his head, and rooted his nose violently toward the ground, ripping the reins right through Julian's meticulously manicured, blister-free fingers. Julian lurched forward, almost hitting his chin on the saddle horn. Hey! No! Bad pony! Julian scolded, gathering the reins again and kicking his heels. Forward! Impulsion! Hank turned his horse around and trotted back. Julian, what in the Sam Hill are you doing to that animal? I am asking for collection and connection, Julian said defensively, adjusting his man-bun, which had shifted slightly out of place. He is completely ignoring my seat and leg aids. He's leaning on the bit. He needs to round his back and engage his hindquarters. Hank rubbed his temples. Son, Buster ain't doing ballet. You're holding his face so tight he thinks you want him to stop, but you're kicking his ribs so hard he thinks you want him to go. You're giving the poor boy a crisis of faith. Drop the reins. Hold him in one hand. Give him some slack. If I drop the contact, I lose control of his shoulders, Julian argued, citing chapter and verse of the classic German riding scale. Out here, Hank said, his voice lowering to a serious, gravelly tone, control is an illusion. You ain't controlling the horse, you're partnering with him. You tell him the job and you let him do it. Now slack the reins before Buster decides to put you in the dirt. Reluctantly, Julian dropped the reins into one hand and allowed the leather to drape loosely over Buster's neck. Instantly, the horse let out a long breath, lowered his head, and began a smooth, ground-covering walk, following the other horses. Julian sat stiffly, feeling entirely vulnerable. In his world, a loose rein meant danger. It meant a lack of discipline. But as they rode out of the ranch yard and into the vast, sprawling expanse of the Wyoming scrublands, Julian had to admit Buster's walk was surprisingly smooth. They rode for 3 hours. This wasn't a leisurely walk around a manicured property. They climbed steep, rocky ravines where Buster had to scramble like a mountain goat. They crossed rushing creeks that came up to the stirrups. Julian, whose riding muscles were perfectly tuned for a 20-minute show jumping round on flat sand, was burning. His thighs ached. His lower back was screaming. The heavy leather of the saddle, unyielding and hard, was chafing his pristine breeches. How much longer?" Julian gasped, taking a sip from a canteen that tasted slightly of old tin. "We're just getting started," Caleb called back, easily rolling a cigarette with one hand while his horse ambled along. "We got about 50 heads of strays down in the gully. Got to push 'em up the ridge before the sun gets too low." Julian groaned. He looked down at Buster. The horse wasn't even sweating. He was just plodding along, conserving his energy, reading the terrain with a casual brilliance that Julian was slowly beginning to respect. Buster didn't need a rider to tell him where to put his feet over the rocks. He figured it out himself. Eventually, they found the cattle. A chaotic mass of mooing, shifting red bodies huddled in a brush-filled canyon. "All right, boys," Hank instructed. "Caleb, you and me will take the left flank. Julian, you stay on the right. Just keep 'em from breaking into the timber. Keep a wall." "Keep a wall," Julian repeated, nodding confidently. "I can do that. Geometry, spacing. Simple." They began moving the herd. For the first 10 minutes, it went smoothly. The cattle moved in a slow, grumbling mass. Julian rode on the edge, feeling quite proud of himself. He sat deep, posing a little, imagining how cool he looked. He even considered taking out his phone for a selfie. And then chaos struck. A massive, ornery 2-year-old steer at the edge of the herd decided he was absolutely not going up the ridge. With a snort, the steer wheeled around and broke into a dead sprint, heading straight for the thick timber right past Julian. "Hold him, Julian!" Hank bellowed over the noise of the herd. Julian's training kicked in. He gathered his reins tightly in 2 hands, sat back, and tried to perform a sophisticated leg yield to push his horse laterally to block the cow. Half halt, outside leg, inside rein, Julian muttered frantically. Buster ignored him completely. Buster didn't speak German dressage. Buster spoke cow. Seeing the steer breaking away, the little yellow quarter horse's instincts, honed by generations of breeding and a decade of hard work, ignited like a stick of dynamite. Without warning, Buster dropped his center of gravity by 1.5 feet. He spun 180 degrees on his hind legs with the speed and violence of a sports car taking a hairpin turn. Julian, who was perfectly balanced for a horse moving forward, was left completely in the dust by physics. His upper body snapped sideways. His perfectly coiffed man-bun whipped through the air, the hair tie snapping under the sheer G-force. His pristine tall boots flew out of the stirrups. "Whoa!" Julian screamed, dropping the reins completely and doing the only thing a desperate man could do. He grabbed the giant wooden saddle horn with both hands and clung onto it for dear life. With Julian entirely out of the equation, Buster went to work. If you've never seen a true cutting horse work, it's a thing of violent, terrifying beauty. The steer zigged to the left. Buster mirrored him instantly, cutting him off. The steer skidded to a halt and bolted right. Buster threw himself to the right, his shoulder practically scraping the dirt, blocking the path. Julian was a rag doll. He was bounced, thrown, and whipped back and forth. All his theories about absolute rider control were shattered. He wasn't the captain of this ship. He was a terrified passenger strapped to the mast during a hurricane. He realized with absolute clarity that if he tried to pull the reins or tell this horse what to do right now, he would ruin everything. Buster didn't need him. Buster was the professional here. "Get him, Buster!" Caleb whooped from across the dust cloud. With one final aggressive lunge, Buster bit the air right behind the steer's tail. The steer, thoroughly defeated, turned around and trotted meekly back to the center of the herd. Buster instantly stopped, let out a massive snort that blew dust into the air, and stood perfectly still, his breathing steady. Julian sat frozen in the saddle. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a jackhammer. His chest was heaving. His hair, once a symbol of metropolitan grooming, was wild, tangled, and caked in Wyoming red dirt. His hands, still clamped onto the horn in a death grip, were shaking. Slowly, Hank trotted over on his tall roan gelding. He pushed his Stetson back up on his head and looked at Julian. He looked at the wild hair, the wide eyes, and the white knuckles. "Well, I'll be," Hank said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. "You stayed in the saddle, and you had the good sense to drop the reins and let the horse do his job." Julian swallowed hard, his throat dry. He slowly loosened his grip on the horn and patted Buster's sweaty, thick neck. He felt the massive muscles twitch beneath the coat. It wasn't the refined, elegant musculature of a show jumper. It was the raw, functional power of a working partner. He is incredible," Julian whispered, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. "I didn't do anything. He did it all." "That's the secret, Julian," Hank said softly, leaning on his saddle horn. "In the arena, you tell the horse exactly what to do every second. Out here in the real world, the terrain is too unpredictable. The cows are too wild. You can't micromanage nature. You have to trust your partner. You give him his head, and you trust him to carry you through." Julian looked down at the dirty, scruffy little pony. He felt a wave of profound humility wash over him. He had spent his whole life trying to master horses, trying to make them bend to his absolute will. He had never simply trusted one. That evening, back at the ranch, the atmosphere had changed. Julian didn't ask about his gluten-free macrobiotic meal. When Cookie, the ranch chef, handed him a tin plate piled high with beef brisket and baked beans, Julian ate it like it was a Michelin-starred meal. He had taken a shower, but he didn't bother putting his hair back up. He just shoved it under a broken-spoke ranch baseball cap Caleb had tossed him. He walked with a slight limp. His inner thighs were officially destroyed. But he walked over to the campfire and sat down next to Hank. "You did good today, city boy," Caleb grinned, poking the fire with a stick. "For a second there, I thought Buster was going to launch you right into orbit." "I thought so too," Julian laughed, a genuine hearty sound he hadn't made in years. "I have never felt so entirely out of control in my life, and honestly, it was the best ride I've ever had." He looked out toward the dark paddocks where the silhouettes of the horses were grazing quietly under a blanket of brilliant, unpolluted stars. Julian realized that when he went back to his pristine arenas and his $500,000 warm bloods, things were going to be different. He wasn't going to stop riding dressage, of course, but he was going to ride differently. He was going to ride with a little less control and a lot more listening. He was going to remember that beneath the braided manes and the polished tack, every horse had a spirit that deserved a little bit of slack in the reins. He raised his tin cup of bitter black coffee toward Hank. "To Buster," Julian said, "the best professor I've ever had." Hank tapped his cup against Julian's. "To real riding, son." Welcome to the dirt. And there you have it, folks. Sometimes the only way to truly master something is to let go of the control you think you have. Julian arrived at that ranch as a rider who demanded perfection, but he left as a horseman who understood partnership. What about you guys? Have you ever had a horse or an experience that completely humbled you and changed the way you look at things? Let me know down in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed Julian's rough ride at the Broken Spoke Ranch, please do me a massive favor. Hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with a friend who might need a reminder to let go of the reins every once in a while. Until next time, keep your heels down, your eyes up, and remember to trust the ride. See you in the next one!